Yeah, we need to get started with class here. We're starting a little late, but that's all right. We've reached the end of an era in here. Nearing the end of Genesis. We only have two more chapters left, 49 and 50. So we're going to do our best to finish it. This morning we should be able to, I think. So Genesis 49 and 50, the only ones left. We're just going to get right into it, not waste any time here. So chapter 49, starting in verse 1, Jacob is nearing his death here, and he wanted to say some final words to his children. So verse 1 says, he called his sons, he said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Gather yourselves together, and hear, you sons of Jacob, hearken unto Israel your father. And so at this point in Jacob's life, he seems to have consistent foreknowledge as a blessing from God of what happens in the future. I suppose whenever he wants to, or whenever when he has some type of sign from God to start doing so. And he wanted to tell his children about what would happen to them in the last days, as he calls it. This is an indefinite amount of time in the future of when his descendants would be living in the land of Canaan. And so what he wanted to tell all of his sons was things that wouldn't specifically happen to his sons personally, but what would happen to their children and their children after them many years in the future. So for some of his sons, there would be good news, and for some, there would be bad news. And so in verses 3 through 15, he first addresses the sons that he had with Leah. And how he lists all of his sons here are not in order of when they were born from oldest to youngest, but in groups of which wives he had them with. And so the first are with Leah. And so this will be Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and then Issachar and Zebulun. And so first he addresses Reuben. This was his first child, and it was the first one he had with Leah. He says to him in verse 3, Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. So he's really bragging on Reuben so far because he was the first, and of course he does love him as his first child. But Reuben, of course, has made some pretty big mistakes in life. So he says in verse 4, he is unstable as water. Other translations may say he's undisciplined as water. He says, thou shalt not excel. This means he's not going to get double blessings as he normally would as a firstborn child or firstborn son of his father. But he'll be on the same level as most all of his other brethren in receiving inheritance. He says, because thou wentest up to my father's bed, and thou defilest it, and went up to my couch. So this was, of course, Reuben's decision to have inappropriate relations with one of his father's wives in Genesis 35 and verse 22. And so this is a consequence of it. It's unfortunate for him, but it is simply a consequence of what he had done in the past. So that's what he says to Reuben. As for Simeon and Levi, these are his second and third sons of Jacob and Leah. He groups them together. He calls them their brethren. He says their instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. And so though all of these brothers are, of course, real blood brothers, half or full blood or whatnot, what he was doing here, he was specifically calling them out together because of the sinful thing that they did together to a different nation. In Genesis 34, verses 25 through 30, where they killed the men of Shechem. And so he is telling them that they have more of an alliance than the other brethren. He says in verse 6, O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, mine honor, be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. And so evidently he was apparently so repulsed and ashamed of their actions of what they did, killing all these men of Shechem, that he was audibly saying, he said, I'm not going to bless you two in the same way that I usually would. He says he's calling out his soul not to. He's making sure he's not going to have any second thoughts about it. He's making sure he is indeed not going to bless them in a normal way. They not only killed these men mercilessly, but they went overboard with it when they did kill them. They had done the act of killing. They chose to kill them after they had reached a agreement of coming together, Jacob's family and the men of Shechem. And so they went against their father's wishes, and they made the women and children as slaves, and they they lamed their oxen as well. And so Jacob, he was not happy with them at all for this. So because he's not happy with them, he says in verse 7, the second half of verse 7, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. In the Truth for Today commentary, they give a explanation of the consequences of Jacob's curse here, as they write, this prophecy pointed hundreds of years into the future when the Israelites were settled in the land of Canaan. The land that was allotted to Simeon was within the borders of the land belonging to Judah in Joshua 19. Since the descendants of Simeon are not mentioned in the blessing of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, and their tribe is rarely referenced to later in the Old Testament, they may have lost their separate identity by being absorbed into the tribe of Judah. The Levites became the priestly tribe, and they received 48 cities scattered throughout the tribes. But they had no separate land grant apart from the rest of the Israelites. And so that's what ended up happening for Simeon and Levi. So starting in verse, where is it here? Starting in verse 8, he now moves on to Judah. This is the fourth son of Jacob and Leah. And so Judah also has not done the best things in life, as he is the one who suggested they sell Joseph into slavery in Genesis 37. And he had also inappropriate relations with his daughter-in-law. This was unknowingly, but it was still a sinful action, whether he knew it or not, in Genesis 38. But even though he had those bad qualities about him, it seems to be the case that in the eyes of Jacob and his brethren as a whole, Judah had redeemed himself later in life by maturing into a more wiser individual. We see that as he attempts to make peaceful, as he tries to have a peaceful relationship with himself and his father and his whole family and Joseph when they didn't know his true identity. And so he is going to be blessed in a better way, as that Reuben and I believe his older brother should have been. And Judah was younger than them, but he was going to be blessed more than them because he was more of a righteous and mature person at this point. And so verse 8, he talks about him. These are only good things said about him here. He says, Judah, thou art he who thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. So verse 8 is confirmation of what would happen with Judah's descendants opposed to Jacob's descendants, as Judah would be a leader to them. He says in verse 9 that Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up, and he stooped down. He crouched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? And so this whole comparison in verse 9 is of Judah and his descendants as to a lion as it grows from a cub to a more stronger lion. A lion is often seen as kind of the top dog in a jungle setting, and really a strong animal in general. The king of the jungle, a lion is also often called, and so it's also a symbol of authority. And so the details of this comparison, we were taught this in school. You might have heard it before. It's pretty cool how it's listed out here. And so we have first Judah, the man. He's described as a lion's whelp. That's a cub who grows into a young lion. That's the developing tribe of Judah, and they attack its prey. These will eventually be the Canaanites in the southern part of the Promised Land with ferocity, as they have a conquest of Canaan. And then, as a powerful and mature lion, under David's leadership eventually, he is said to have returned to his lair where he lies down as a lion, and as he sits there at the top with God on his side, is who will dare to rouse him up, who will dare to challenge him again when the nation of Judah becomes as strong as it will be one day. And so verse 10 is continued about him. The scepter, it says, shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. The idea of the scepter being is a sign of leadership and kingship and authority, not departing as it goes all the way down to a very special person that comes from the tribe of Judah, and that is, of course, Jesus the Christ. We studied this verse, and a whole lot of times it was kind of resaid and resaid over and over because of how important it is. Verse 10, that the scepter will not depart from Judah. This verse is important because it shows a clear picture of where Jesus comes from, and that physically Jesus didn't come from any other descendants. He, of course, has authority. Jesus does. He's the King of Kings. And so if the scepter shall not depart from Judah, and Jesus comes from this line of Judah, that speaks volume of this prophecy happening now, of what would eventually happen for Jesus and who he is. And so verse 11 is continued for Judah, bringing his foal unto the vine, and his donkey's colt unto the choice vine. We'll read the second half of verse 11 in a second here, but Jacob is now continuing to compare Judah to a very rich nation. In verses 11 through 12 is blessings for Judah's descendants to come. And so David, he was obviously a very important descendant of Judah. He would be so blessed physically that Jacob compares that figuratively to David being able to tether his donkey to a vine, and the donkey would be able to eat of the vine if it so choose. And this was out of the normal, because in that time people wouldn't just let their cattle eat of any public source of food whenever they wanted, but someone like David and someone of the line of Judah, his nation, would be able to, because they would be so blessed in their lives. And normally the riding of a donkey signified peace and prosperity, and that is seen in Zechariah 9 and Matthew 21. And many descendants of Judah would experience lots of good things happening to them in life. So the second half of verse 11, he washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine and his teeth white with milk. So this is the last thing Jacob says about Judah here. It's his final exaggerated way of saying Judah's descendants would be blessed. And he says they would be so blessed and so rich that they'd be able to wash their clothes in wine because of how much of it they had. They'd be able to drink so much wine that their eyes would be bloodshot, it says. And it says they'd have milk to drink, and their teeth would glisten more than their lips that were apparently stained with wine. This is not to say that the Bible condones drinking of intoxicating wine of any sort, as there have already been plenty of times in Genesis and throughout the Bible that God does not approve of intoxicating wine and getting drunk for the sinful actions that come from it. But Jacob here is just saying that they'd be so rich and blessed that they'd have the ability to do that if they wanted to, because wine is expensive. And so he's just saying how blessed and rich they'd be here. So the next son he comes to is Zebulun. Again, he's not listing his sons from oldest to youngest, but in groups of wives. And so Zebulun, he's the 10th son of Jacob in total, but he's the next son of Leah he has with Leah. And so he is mentioned fifth in this list of oldest to youngest for Leah's group of children specifically. And that's a little strange because Issachar was born before Zebulun, but Zebulun is listed first here. So we don't know why that was done. But nonetheless, he moves on to Zebulun, and he says in verse 13 that he will dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for an haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. And so where we see Zebulun's descendants ending up would be close to the sea border, and so they'd be blessed to be able to do trading with other nations more easily. And so only one verse for Zebulun there. And then Issachar, the 9th son of Jacob, and the 6th child of Leah. Issachar is, at least the 9th son of Jacob here. So verse 14 is about Issachar. He says, he is as a strong donkey crouching down between two burdens. And he saw that the rest was good, in the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. And so the descendants of Issachar aren't mentioned too much in later books of the Bible of having too much of impact on anything. They would be a more peaceful nation than others, staying out of battles, but because of that, they would be put into more of a subjection kind of role, sort of not fighting back, letting themselves be sort of bossed around in a sense. And so that's what Jacob means by they'd be a strong donkey in between two burdens. I believe this is in terms of having the potential to do good, but they'd be just crouching down between two burdens. So that's to say they'd be willing to settle down in a place that's comfortable for them in the moment, but for their time as a nation as a whole, it wouldn't benefit them in any way, but they're just doing what they need to do to get by the nation of Issachar eventually. And so that's all the sons of Jacob and Leah there, verses 3 through 15. Anyone have any comments about them so far? So now we move on. In verse 16, he now lists the sons of that he had with the handmaids of Rachel and Leah. This is Zilpah and Bilhah. These are 4 sons here. It's Dan, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. And so Dan is in verse 16. He says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And so we don't have any real instances of Dan or his people being a judge or getting really any type of vindication specifically. But as I was reading through commentaries about Dan, some people agree that this might have been achieved through Samson's victories over the Philistines in Judges 14 through 16, who treated the tribe in a bad way in Judges 13. And so he says, Dan in verse 17 will be a serpent by the way, and adder in the path, that biteth the horse's heels, so that his rider shall fall backwards. And so this specific instance comes from Judges 18, verses 1 through 30. And then last in verse 18, he says, I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. So this expression from Jacob here can be a little confusing because we don't exactly know why he said it out of nowhere. It doesn't exactly have anything to do with Dan, I don't believe. It could have been specific to Dan and his descendants, or just in general from Jacob to all of his sons needing salvation from God here. But that's all he says about Dan, and so now he moves on to Gad. Dan was his 5th son of Jacob, and it was the first son of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. And so Gad, he's the 7th son of Jacob and the first son of Zilpah. This was Leah's handmaid. As for Gad, he said he would be, it says, Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. The positioning of the descendants of Gad was one of little defense, as where they were put, they were essentially surrounded by enemy nations. And because of this, they had to become skilled warriors more than their other brethren and other descendants to constantly defend their land. And it didn't help much that they were a more smaller nation than their other brother nations, because they had to become better fighters than most. They'd, of course, have people attacking them, but they'd win overall. So that's all that said for Gad. And then Asher, this is the 8th son of Jacob, and the 2nd and final son of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid. He says, out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. And so for Asher, there's a blessing and a curse listed here. The blessing is seen in the fact that his descendants would be placed in a very fertile area, which would let them have more food than other nations around them. But their curse was seen in the fact of their royal dainties, or the royal luxuries or riches. And these royal riches they would have would be a curse because of what they would do with their riches. What the descendants of Asher ended up doing was not doing their part in driving out the people of Canaan, but instead trade with them and accept their false gods. And so though they'd be a rich nation, they wouldn't do too much good with it. So that's Asher there. And so Naphtali here is the 6th son of Jacob and the 2nd and final son of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. He says, Naphtali is a hind let loose, he giveth goodly words. So there are many different opinions of what Jacob means here, but the most agreed upon interpretation is one that of the descendants of Naphtali would live more of a life of freedom than their brother nations, since the land that they had would be more away from the people of Canaan. They gave goodly words in the sense of acting fast whenever a problem arose. This was seen in Judges chapter 4. But an unfortunate thing they did was not drive out all the people of Canaan as they were supposed to, but instead they lived among them and even forced some of them to be slaves in Judges chapter 1. And so that's all the sons that he had with the handmaids. So he has 2 more sons listed, Joseph and Benjamin. Any other questions, though, or comments so far? So Joseph and Benjamin, his last 2 sons, these were the only sons he had with Rachel, his favorite wife. So verse 22, Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob, the first child of Rachel. He says, Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The first thing Jacob is comparing Joseph to is speaking of his fruitfulness of Joseph's character. He was a very godly and righteous man. He gives proof of Joseph's good qualities by talking about what happened to him earlier in life in verse 23. He says, the archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him, but his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. So these archers represent his brethren hating Joseph, but his bow represents him staying strong through it all. Even though he wasn't treated right by his brothers, he stayed strong and stayed faithful to God throughout his life. Of course, Joseph wasn't alone in life, as he clearly had God on his side through it all, as well as Jacob, confirming this here. And so verse 25, he continues about Joseph. He says, even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of the breast and of the womb, the blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors, unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. And so Jacob wanted Joseph to remember he was here in this blessed position because of God being governor of Egypt, having a wife and kids in Egypt, even though how he had to get to this point wasn't all beautiful. At this point, he was certainly a blessed man. And so Jacob recognized that he and his family had been blessed more than anyone in his family thus far before him because of his children and where they were now in a comfortable position in Egypt. And so that's all he says about Joseph here. And then the last son is Benjamin, 12th son of Jacob, the second and final one of Rachel. He says, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf, or maybe that's raven, as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. And so though Benjamin was the youngest son, how his descendants would act would be not one of helplessness and weak as a young child might look, but throughout the books of Judges and First Chronicles, we see many verses that the descendants of Benjamin were seen as powerful and skilled fighters, having a reputation about some of them of how powerful they were. And so that's Benjamin there. So that's all his children listed now of what Jacob wanted to tell them, of what would happen to their descendants. And so as he gets through with all of his sons here, he says in verse 28 now, that all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is it that their father spake unto them and blessed them. Every one according to his blessing he blessed them. And he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. So Abraham originally bought this, and his children and descendants and grandchildren now will be using it as well to bury their people as well. It says in verse 31, there they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Abraham his wife. And there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And so Jacob has already specifically made this request to Joseph. And now he's saying it one more time to all of his sons here before he officially dies. He notes that he specifically buried Leah there. He wasn't able to bury Rachel there, his favorite wife, because she died while they were in the midst of traveling and they weren't near this cave, and so they buried her elsewhere. So verse 33, when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed, and he yielded up the ghost, and he was gathered unto his people. This is a very fitting way to explain how a follower of God passes away. There's nothing harmful, nothing scary about it. It's just being reunited with loved ones and with God in heaven as a follower of God. So we're certainly blessed with that. So that's all of chapter 49 there. Anyone have any questions? about this chapter or comments? Right, chapter 50 now, last chapter here. Moses, as he's writing this book, he wastes no time in getting into chapter 50. As right after Jacob's death, it says that Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. So these men embalmed Jacob to preserve him as they eventually bring him to the cave of Machpelah. That would have been a long time, or not a long time, but a little bit before they could get there. So they embalmed him to preserve his body. And so verse 3, 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. So I read in a commentary about this that the fact that Joseph only used the physicians to embalm his father meant that he went against typical Egyptian religious practices that were associated with Egyptian gods of the dead. And so this shows his faithfulness still strong toward God, is still present, even though it's not specifically stated here. Through his actions, he still obviously respected God and had his faith toward him. And so as they do these days of mourning, it says in verse 4, as those were passed, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, and he said, if now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, lo, I die. In my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shalt thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. Since Joseph was in a high position, the governor of Egypt and Pharaoh himself even said that he would be a ruler of everyone other than Pharaoh. Why is he now acting in a sort of humble manner toward court officials of Pharaoh, because he should have been over them? Well, according to other commentaries, it says as he was mourning his father, he was most likely in a pretty unclean state now, not a very presentable state to be in public. He was likely unclean, unshaven, and overall not presentable to be in public, let alone in front of Pharaoh. And so he is being in a respectful way here, asking the servants of Pharaoh to ask Pharaoh if Joseph can do this. And so he also probably just wanted to be humble in making his want to go bury his father to seem as more of a request rather than a demand to Pharaoh here. And so Pharaoh, being supportive as always to Joseph, he responded in verse 6. He says, go up and bury thy father, according as he made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. All the house of Joseph went, his brethren, his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. So it's a very big group going with Joseph to bury Jacob. He has sort of entourage with him. So verse 10, as they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, this is a very grievous mourning to the Egyptians, wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. So Abel Mizraim means meadow of Egypt, which leads many to think that this location of Atad was in a fruitful area with a sort of river around it somewhere. So as they were doing this, and as this came to pass in verse 12, his sons did unto him according as he commanded them. They're obedient sons at this point, all of them here. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with a field for a possession of a burying place from Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. And Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went with him to bury his father, after he had buried his father. So they all do this. Funerals are often not too pleasant, but they can often be a time of closure for one and whoever they are burying. So it's probably obviously a very sad time for them, but as followers of God, they could all be rest assured that Jacob was now in a very comfortable place in heaven. And so as they go back to Egypt, we see in verse 15, it says that when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite to us all the evil which we did unto him. They evidently thought that the only reason Joseph had been kind to them thus far was because of Jacob, and that Jacob was the only thing holding Joseph's anger from them. And so because of this, what they thought, it says in verse 16 that they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying that thy father did command before he died, saying, so shall ye say unto Joseph, forgive, I pray thee now, that the trespass of thy brethren, and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. So at this point, Joseph's brothers feared him so much that they didn't even say this to Joseph themselves. They got a servant to do it, or a messenger, it says, to tell him this. We don't have any record of Jacob telling his sons to tell Joseph to do this, which lead many to believe that they were lying about this, about the fact that Jacob didn't tell them to tell Joseph this. Not that Jacob wouldn't want Joseph to be in a good relationship with them and forgive them, but he really already did anyway. And so nonetheless, this is what the brothers claim here. And so as Joseph hears this in verse 17, it says that he wept when they spake to him. So whether Joseph is believing this or not, he is still soft-hearted and loving toward them, as he has been always thus far. Whenever he has heard them being kind, he has often wept and just been nice to them, no matter what they've done to him. And so as this happens, it says in verse 18 that his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we be thy servants. Just being as respectful as they can, because they're so fearful. But Joseph says to them, verse 19, fear not, for am I in the place of God? That is to say, am I as great as God, that I am allowed to just legitimately punish people for mistakes whenever I want? This is a rhetorical question, because the answer is obviously no. Joseph is trying to get across here. He says, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. He has said this in a different way before, of that while they thought they were being mean to him, it was actually a blessing overall. And so he says, God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore, fear you not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And so he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. This is just as he did before when he first revealed his true identity to his brothers, and just as he did when his whole family came into Goshen as at first. And so his brothers definitely should have realized what kind of righteous person Joseph was at this point, but they apparently did not. But by this point, they certainly for sure did, because Joseph reiterated that he was going to be kind to them. So we have a couple more verses here. Any other questions or any comments thus far before we end this chapter? So verse 22, Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and he lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought unto Joseph's knees. So Joseph got to see his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren here. He said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land and unto the land which he sware to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's saying what God promised to his forefathers before him, that their time to come into Canaan, it would be a long time before they would eventually be living in Canaan as a permanent place, but they would eventually be there. And Joseph is reiterating it here. Though they're in Egypt now, eventually they would come back to Canaan. And so he says in verse 25, it just says in general in verse 25, that Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. So he's giving some final words to his family, noting that God was still with them, he's still caring for them, and that this is not their permanent home here. And so as he gives this last command to them, it says in verse 26 that he died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So that's all of Genesis here. It's been a good time studying it. It's a very great book, Genesis is, as we've seen, showing the beginning of time as well as the foundation of Israel, as a foundation of the whole Old Testament and Bible as a whole. So hope you've all enjoyed it. I'll only be here for about a month left until I officially leave here, and so I thought a good book that we could start studying here that I could get through easily would be the book of Jude. And so if that would be okay with all y'all, it's only one chapter, so I think we could get through it for the rest of my time here. But I thank you all for your attention.